Regina Leuven.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And now that I find myself seated on this side of the House, I feel a sudden compulsion to speak about the middle class and those working hard to join it. And I'd like to make the point that one of the building blocks for our middle class has been free collective bargaining. Things such as better wages, safer working conditions, paid time off, these have all come through free collective bargaining. And sometimes arbitration is used as a substitute, but when we talk about these new pioneering gains for middle-class people, they really can only come from free collective bargaining. So, Mr. Speaker, I think this is a goal that we should share on all sides of this House. And we should be very concerned when the government steps in to take away the ability for free collective bargaining for a few reasons. One is that it sets a very negative precedent for other areas of the economy. Another is that it sets a negative precedent for Canada Post itself, because if the employees and the management know that they should expect that the federal government is going to step in with back-to-work legislation, it really takes away any incentive or any impetus they have to try to negotiate an actual settlement. It actually gives them a bit of an incentive to wait around for the government to bring in this legislation. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Labour actually recognizes that it's not desirable to have back-to-work legislation and has described it as a last resort and has suggested that all available options were exhausted before bringing in back-to-work legislation. And this seems a bit doubtful to me, given the fact that we don't even have a full-scale strike at Canada Post. We just have rotating strikes. But I would actually like to use some of my time to ask the Minister of Labour whether she attempted to negotiate an essential service protocol with the employees of Canada Post to ensure that they would continue to deliver the checks to low-income people and to charities that she's spoken about and deems to be such an important service. So I'm wondering if I could turn it over to the Minister of Labour to answer that question.
Minister of Labour.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that the member opposite realizes that we have a high degree of respect for organized labour, and in fact such a degree of respect that the first piece of legislation that we introduced and passed was Bill C-4, which restored the rights of organized labour to collectively bargain and organize, which repealed 525 and 377, two very harmful pieces of legislation that the Conservatives had rammed through this House in an effort to actually diminish the ability of organized labour to grow their movement, to work, as the member points out, on ensuring that there's decent work for people all across the country. We also ratified ILO 98, which guarantees the right to organizing and collective bargaining. We've introduced legislation that we've worked on with unions, that unions have been calling for decades, things like pay equity, federally regulated proactive pay equity, something that unions have been calling for, including the union that's involved in this dispute, flexible work arrangements, protecting federally regulated workers from the experience of violence or harassment in the workplace, C-65, which recently passed. We've introduced updates to the Canada Labour Code to modernize the Canada Labour Code and protect the most vulnerable in the workplace, again in partnership with organized labour. The list goes on, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the work that we've done in partnership with unions, because we recognize the important role they play in establishing a standard that often protects the most vulnerable, in fact, people who are not unionized in this country. But I will also speak to the second part of the member's question. The member asked, what have we done to actually ensure that we could work with the parties to arrive at a collective agreement, or to help them arrive at a collective agreement? And I will tell you that, in my perspective, we've done everything we can to support the parties to get there themselves. For example, over a year ago, both parties agreed to work with a mediator. So we appointed the Federal Mediation Service early on in their talks to help them have productive talks, to work through some of the substantial issues that both the union was facing and the corporation was facing. The mediators worked with the parties for well over a year. When those talks broke down, in fact, they asked
Order. 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 The honourable member for Regina Leuven.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that the minister indicated to this House earlier today was the criteria that would be presented to the arbitrator. And one of the criteria the arbitrator is supposed to consider is the financial sustainability of Canada Post. The financial sustainability of Canada Post has often been questioned because the government has insisted that as a Crown corporation, it account for its pension plan on a solvency basis. This is a very unrealistic assumption that posits that Canada Post be wound up and have to pay out all of its pension benefits at once. Of course, Mr. Speaker, this formula necessarily shows an unfunded liability and a problem with financial sustainability. Some have proposed that it would make much more sense to treat Canada Post like the rest of the federal public service and account for its pension plan on a going concern basis. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Labour whether she will be instructing the arbitrator to evaluate Canada Post's financial sustainability with a solvency valuation approach or with a going concern approach. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Before we go to the Minister of Labour, just to reiterate the format that we're in here. We're in Committee of the Whole, where members essentially have up to 20 minutes to state. In the course of that 20 minutes, they are able to pose a question to a minister, but the time is their own. And so it's only it's not like a question and comment period here. The minister had her opening remarks. After she concluded, we went to the next speaker, the honourable member for Regina Leuven. It's his time now for up to 20 minutes. He can speak and use some of his time as he wishes to pose questions to the minister. And so we'll follow, and the next speaker will be the same format. The honourable member for, the honourable Minister of Labour.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member has asked me to talk about the guiding principles that we are asking the arbitrator mediator to consider as he works or she works to help the parties. Should we reach the decision? Should we reach the point where the parties need that assistance? And so the guiding principles that the mediator arbitrator needs to consider is. First of all, to ensure the health and safety of the employees is protected, something that I'm sure the member opposite would agree is a critical consideration. To ensure that the employees receive equal pay for work of equal value. Again, I think the member opposite, I don't want to assume this, but would probably not have a challenge with that guiding principle. To ensure the fair treatment of temporary or part-time employees and other employees in non-standard employment as compared to full-time and permanent employees. And yes, to ensure the financial sustainability of the employer, but also to create a culture of collaborative labour management relations and to have the employer provide high-quality service at a reasonable price to Canadians. Now, the member is asking about the financial sustainability of the employer. I don't think this is an unreasonable principle to consider, Mr. Speaker, because in fact the employment of the worker depends on the financial sustainability of the employer. The employer has confines, just like any other employer, that they have an operation to deliver with a specific budget. They have limited resources to raise additional revenue, and they have to be prudent with their resources. And so the financial sustainability of the corporation, of course, has to be a consideration, because ultimately this is about protecting those good quality jobs. Thank you.
The honourable member for Regina Leuven.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, in this debate, the minister has spoken a great deal about the needs of lower-income people and smaller businesses that might depend on service from Canada Post. Now, something that would help those lower-income individuals and smaller businesses, but would also contribute to Canada Post's financial sustainability, would be for it to move into the area of postal banking. This would provide much needed financial services for communities and smaller enterprises that are often underserved by the big banks, while at the same time providing a new source of revenue for Canada Post, a new way of using its offices all across this country and so many communities. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would like to give the Minister a chance to explain whether in this search for financial sustainability, she or the arbitrator will give serious consideration to implementing postal banking.
Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not the arbitrator's place to design the corporate model or the services that the corporation will deliver. It is the arbitrator's place, though, to consider the financial sustainability of the employer. The corporation really is the appropriate place to have those conversations. From my perspective, Mr. Speaker, this corporation has to be financially prudent. They have a large operation and they have financial constraints. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, we also know that they have to take very seriously the other principles that we have laid out for the arbitrator, including things like the health and safety of workers, including things like the fair treatment of temporary or part-time employees. Mr. Speaker, it is really the corporation's responsibility to chart its path in terms of the suite of services that it offers and how it offers those services to Canadians. Thank you.
Member for Regina Leuven.
Now, Mr. Speaker, something that the government promised during the past election campaign was to restore door-to-door mail delivery. And, of course, keeping that promise would make a huge positive difference for Canada Post and for its employees. I would like to give the Minister a chance to inform this House on when the government is going to restore door-to-door mail delivery.
Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, our government committed to placing a moratorium on ending door-to-door delivery, and that's in fact what we did. However, having said that, we're here to discuss the back-to-work legislation that the action that we're taking to restore postal service to Canadians during this very difficult time. From my perspective, again, refer to my previous answer. This is at the discretion of the corporation at this point, how they deliver their services, how they, what their particular model of service is. Of course, we've given guidelines. The member knows that. The member knows that we've done a lot to actually transform Canada Post. We've given them quite a bit of latitude. Having said that, these principles we believe are very balanced. We know that the arbitrator will use these principles, will consider these principles carefully to make sure that we get to an agreement, should that be necessary, should the parties not be able to come to that agreement on their own in a balanced, fair way that considers the concerns of the union, but also the constraints of the corporation. Thank you.